Wealthy merchants bring in big cargoes, which they unload and unhesitantly send into the markets without thinking in the meantime of any security or checking the account or keeping watch over the goods, said Abdul Razak in 1442 in his book Description of Calcut. Calcut was known as the City of Spices, a market city where merchants traded their goods for pepper and cinnamon from India and a variety of goods from other areas as well. In some ways, such as its ability to provide security and the diversity of people who shopped at the markets, Calicut was like other big trading cities along the well-traveled trade routes. In other ways, such as the type of currency it used and how the government unit made money on trade, it differed from trading cities elsewhere. The similarities and differences among trading cities were also reflected in the larger trading networks. Several major trading networks connected people in Africa, Europe, and Asia in the years between 1200 and 1450, like the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. The Silk Roads through the Gobi Desert and mountain passes in China and Central Asia to the Southwest Asia and Europe, on which merchants tended to specialize in luxury goods. You can see the amount of cities that developed over this incredibly long route and a very treacherous route at times. I mean, we're talking deserts, one of the largest mountain chains in the world right here, just to get into some pretty, independent-minded warrior-like tribes. But these large cities connected it and kept it safe. This was one of the safest areas for trade. Everyone felt protected. There was, the Mongol Empire for a while to keep it secure. So great time for trade. Indian Ocean trade was monsoon dependent in the Indian Ocean, and it linked East Asia with Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Southwest Asia, on which merchants exchanged goods too heavy to transport by land. Goods traveled extensively by seas, and many of these different trading cities that arose here became expert sailors, especially people from Africa and Southwest Asia up here. And they depended on these winds. These winds carried them favorably one way or the other, depending on the season. Some of the goods that went: lumber, incredibly heavy; gold, very heavy; ivory, coffee, books, textiles, and then, of course, once the Dutch are going to colonize this area, they're going to participate in it as well. The trans-Saharan trade routes from North Africa and the Mediterranean basin went across the desert to West and East Africa, on which merchants traded salt from North Africa with gold from the kingdoms south of the desert. And here's a map that shows the connections between these humongous and incredibly important kingdoms in Africa that controlled the trade routes. I mean, when I say control the trade routes, you got to remember that this is a desert in which only local merchants are going to know how to survive this. You take off on a camel and you don't know where the first oasis is, you are dead. You are dead in the desert. And so they certainly, definitely controlled this. And I mean, to a certain extent, they still control this today. That is how hard it is to get through this area. And of course, we see the exchange of gold moving towards the east where those luxury goods were, and all of it kind of feeding this trade between the different routes. While each exchange network had its unique characteristics, all were similar in their origins, purpose, and effects. Interregional trade began well before the Common Era as agrarian cultures consolidated into stable settlements. The trade that flourished between 1200 and 1450 built on the roots these early traders and conquerors first traced. As kingdoms and empires expanded, so did the trade routes they controlled and traveled. The post-classical trading networks also needed the stability of established states to grow and expand. Stable kingdoms, caliphates, city-states, or empires assured merchants that the routes and the merchants themselves would be protected, which is why the wealthy merchants in Calicut could walk away from their cargoes knowing they would not be stolen. Stable politics also supported the technological upgrades that made trade more profitable. Nautical equipment such as the magnetic compass and lateen sail, high-yielding strains of crops, and saddles to allow for carriage of heavy loads of goods also encouraged further trade. The trading network shared an overall economic purpose to exchange what people were able to grow or produce for what they wanted, needed, or could use to trade for other items. In other words, their purpose was primarily economic. However, as you have seen, people exchanged much more than just products. Diplomats and missionaries also traveled the trade routes, negotiating alliances, and also preaching to converts. Together, merchants, diplomats, and missionaries exchanged ways of life as well as economic goods. All the exchange networks also experience similar effects. Because of the very nature of a network, which can be described as a fabric of cords crossing irregular distances, knotted for strength at crossings, the trade routes all gave rise to trading cities, the knots that held the network together. The growth of trading cities gave rise to another effect of the trade networks, centralization. Malacca, for example, grew wealthy from the fees levied on ships and cargoes passing through the Strait of Malacca. To prevent piracy, Malacca used its wealth in part to develop a strong navy, an endeavor that required centralized planning. Trading cities along each of the trade routes underwent similar developments, using their wealth to keep the routes and the city safe. Another aspect of trade in cities that encouraged centralization was the desire for a standardized currency. Widely accepted currency sped up transactions and enabled merchants to measure the value of products. Despite their similarities, the networks of exchange were different in some ways, especially in the goods they exchanged, the nature of the routes and transportation, the technologies they inspired, and the religions they spread. As you can see from this chart, they have extensive differences. From the Silk Road right here, we see that it's an east-west route. The different trading goods are silk, tea, porcelain, horses, saddles, fruit. Some of the transportation are the same, but most of them are different. And the saddles and an inn arises, and the religions are mostly Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism, and Islam. For Indian Ocean, it's gold, ivory. It's connecting Africa with Southwest Asia and South Asia. They used mostly boats, which meant that the technology that improved involved naval technology. Their main religions were Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism, and Christianity. And then lastly, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. There was a north and south one, horses, books, salt, gold, ivy, cloth, slaves, caravans of camels for carrying goods, and people walked, and technology was the different saddles for camels. Generally, the two religions were Islam and Christianity. The trading networks also had unique currencies and commercial practices. For example, at one time, silk was not only a commodity, but also a currency. In places in Southeast Asia, tin was used as a currency standard. West African states used cowrie shells as currency. In time, however, states shifted to a money economy based on gold and other metal coins. To make commerce less bulky, the Chinese invented flying cash and established the precursors of banks, including the practice of extending credit. The rising demand for luxury goods spurred efforts to make production more efficient than it had been. China went through a period of proto-industrialization as it sought to meet the demand for iron, steel, and porcelain. New business practices such as partnerships for sharing the risk of investment began to emerge. The production of goods such as textiles and porcelain in China and spices in South and Southeast Asia increased to meet demands. As the amount of goods increased, the volume of trade on maritime trade routes began to supersede that of the overland trade routes. Larger ships were needed as well as improved navigational knowledge and technology. The demand for labor arose along with the growing demand for products. The forms of labor from earlier periods continued. Free peasant farmers, craft workers, or artisans in cottage industries, people forced to work to pay off debts, and people forced into labor through enslavement. Trade in slaves was common along the Indian Ocean and trans-Saharan routes. Large-scale projects such as irrigation canals, military defenses, and great buildings called for the work of thousands of organized laborers. Kinship ties often played a role in coordinating these large-scale projects. The typical social structures during the period between 1200 and 1450 were still defined by class or caste, and societies, with rare exceptions, remained patriarchies. There were, however, areas where women exercised more power and influence. For example, even though the vast Mongol Empire was a patriarchy, Mongol women had somewhat more freedom than women in most other parts of Afro-Eurasia. Mongol women moved freely and refused the burqa from the west and foot binding from the east. Women were also often top advisors to the Great Khan. In Europe, women worked as farmers and artisans, and they had their own guilds. In Southeast Asia, women were skilled in the practices of marketplace, operating and controlling marketplaces as representatives of powerful families. Outside of these limited areas, however, women within other major regions still experienced far fewer opportunities and freedoms than men in virtually all aspects of life. The interconnections that spurred so much vibrant economic and cultural exchange also led to a steep population decline as merchants, diplomats, and missionaries transferred the bubonic plague and other infectious diseases along the trade routes. The plague, named the Black Death, contributed to the decline of once great cities such as Constantinople. Most believe that at least a third of Europe's population died during this period. China experienced outbreaks in 1330s and 1350s, causing tens of millions of deaths. Changes in trade networks led to cultural diffusion and the development of educational centers in cities such as Canton, Timbuktu, Cairo, and Venice. Political instability and increased agriculture strained the environment. For example, soil erosion from deforestation or overgrazing forced growing populations to migrate to other areas. It also increased the spread of massive amounts of disease, but at the same time, economic organization was starting to take hold.